Hello, seventh grade historians. Today we are talking about war beginning. This is day 5 of our Civil War mini unit. So let's look at our quote for today. Abraham Lincoln's victory in the election of 1860 convinced Southerners that their way of life was doomed if they stayed in the Union. Many white Southerners believed that their culture could not survive without slavery. So, after much talk about pulling out of the Union, the South finally did it. So make sure you've completed days 1 through 4 and all of today's requirements because you do have a quiz due today. Let's take a look at all of the items you'll want to complete by the end of today. You'll want to read Chapter 54, Lincoln's Problems. Chapter 55, The War Begins. You'll also want to view all of the online lesson content as well as all of this recording. I really encourage you to take notes because you can use those on the quiz that is due today. So, as we've been talking about all week, the U.S. was growing. You can see here the slave population in red, the free population in blue, but the U.S. was growing in general. In terms of population numbers, also growing and expanding westward. And as the U.S. expanded and territories and new states were created, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of compromise over whether or not these states were free or slave states. This created a lot of tension between the North and South, or those supporting slavery and those not. We talked about the Dred Scott decision, which was handed down in 1857. The Supreme Court ruled that blacks were not citizens. That Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom because he was not a citizen. He was rather property. Again, this was the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court. They also said that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, which meant that slavery was allowed in all of the country's territories. Again, really fueling the conflict between those supporting slavery and those not. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, also contributed to the divide between abolitionists. Those are the people that did not like slavery and those that supported slavery. It went viral, so to speak, meaning that everyone was reading it, everyone was talking about it, and it was outraging a lot of people. Some because they were outraged at the the way that slaves were treated and the story, and others were mad, because it shed a very negative light on slavery. So you can see how it was a game changer and led to more divide. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln won the election November 6th, 1860, and it had some consequences. As you can see, a short time later, a month later, essentially, December 20th, 1860, the South Carolina seceded or left the Union, left the United States, which was kind of a domino effect. About a month later, Mississippi seceded. A day after that, Florida seceded. A day after that, Alabama seceded. And then about a week later, Georgia also left the Union. Another week later, Louisiana, and in February, Texas. So the Confederacy officially formed February 8th of 1861. That was the Southern Confederacy, the Southern states that had left the United States, and Lincoln was sworn in. So between the time that he was elected and sworn in as president, these states had seceded or left the Union and formed the Confederacy. All right, so our questions to answer today. How did the events at Fort Sumter trigger the Civil War? What advantages did the North have and what advantages did the South have? Well, let's talk about Lincoln being sworn in as president, the situation. Okay, so Lincoln takes office with 7 states having seceded from the Union. What would you do? That's a tough spot for a brand new president to be in. He thought, okay, well, do they have the right to do that as members of the United States? So he said, no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. Plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. So he's saying, no, they cannot do that. So if they can't, which he's saying they can't, what should be done about it? What should the United States, what should the Union do about it? What should they do to these states that have seceded or left the Union? Are they rebelling? Or are they now hostile? A new hostile foreign country? How are we going to treat these states that have seceded? He's thought about, does Congress have more power here or the president? How are we going to handle this situation? Very complex indeed. And what about all of the government property in the South, like military forts and stuff? So are those still the United States's, or who's in control of those? That was a tough situation, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. So the Confederacy claims property rights. So the Southern Confederacy, those southern states that had seceded, they claim that all previous Union property is now theirs. So going back to those military forts and stuff. The southern states, the Confederacy, are saying, no, that's ours now, including those forts that still have U.S. soldiers in them. So again, a very complex situation. This brings us to Fort Sumter, which is located in South Carolina. You can see Fort Sumter down here. This is going to be essentially the start of the war. And again, this is another map showing us the slave states here, free states in blue, and the light blue are the territories. So you can see the states here, and the purple line here is the border between Union and Confederate boundaries. So let's talk about Fort Sumter. Again, here it is close up, just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Here is another view of it. All right, Fort Sumter. So Star of the West arrives on January 9th, 1861 to resupply Fort Sumter. After taking fire from Fort Moultrie and the Citadel Battery, it turns back out to sea. Here is a more present-day viewpoint of Fort Sumter. All right, so there's a showdown there. So South Carolina tells the United States soldiers to leave. Again, the U.S. soldiers are at the fort, and so now they're being told to leave. Well, they don't. And so South Carolina blocks the fort, and they basically attempt to starve the soldiers out, right? They are kind of blockading them and trying to force them out by essentially starving them. And so now Lincoln is in a tough situation. Should he send supplies? What should he do? How should he handle this? He does, in fact, send supply ships as normally scheduled, kind of just pretending that South Carolina is still a state. So he's kind of ignoring that they have seceded at this point and send supplies as he normally would. And so South Carolina then responds with an attack. So the first attack, the Civil War, has now begun with the attack on Fort Sumter. All right, so how did the events at Fort Sumter trigger the Civil War? Well, the South Carolina declared that the fort was now under control of the Confederacy, but the U.S. troops did not leave. They decided to stay put, and so South Carolina essentially threatened to starve them out, right? All right, well, we're going to block everything, and you'll leave when you're hungry enough. So Lincoln tried to send in supplies to the troops, and when that happened, Confederates opened fire and attacked Fort Sumter. So Americans rejoice, the people are thrilled. What? What do you mean here? Well, most Americans thought that this was going to be a quick little war, one little battle, one swift battle should take care of all this nonsense once and for all. A bunch of men ran up to sign for the military and be part of this one big swift battle. So 4 months go by while both sides make some military preparations, and Americans are feeling very confident, as depicted in this quote. All the bloodshed as a result of secession could be wiped up with a handkerchief, said Leroy Pope Walker, a Southerner. So let's see. They're saying that it's not going to be a big deal. It's just going to be a little bit of blood, and we'll have it over with. That's not going to happen quite as they anticipated. So let's talk about both sides and some advantages and disadvantages of both. So we look at resources in terms of North and South, and I think it's pretty clear that the North kind of had the advantage. North had a higher population, they had more capital, aka money, they had more industry, so more factories, which meant more supplies essentially. They had more railroad tracks, which was good for transporting troops and good for transporting supplies to those troops. And the North even had more farmland. We think of the South, obviously having these large plantations, but the North had some good, amount of farmland as well to feed people specifically troops. So again, North in red, South in green. North had more workers, North had more factories, North had, more goods produced, a lot more goods, more railroads, more textiles, meaning produced goods, more firearms, and more pig iron. So again, on paper, it looks like the North, it's no match, right? The North has a huge advantage. All right, so the North has every material advantage that you can think of, right? More people, more industry, more factory, more food production, but there were some southern advantages. So what were those? The South had actually more experienced fighters. They were just, in general, more experienced outdoorsmen, and they had something known as home field advantage. They knew the land, and there's a certain passion in defending one's own land, as most of the battles were fought in the southern part, in the seceding states. So what advantages did the North have? Well, we looked at the graphs. They had all the material things, the people, the industry, the factory, and the food. But the South had some of these unseen advantages, more skilled fighters, just more natural outdoorsmen, and that advantage of the home field, right? Home field advantage. All right, so our questions to answer here, and I know I went through this rather quickly, but how did the events at Fort Sumter trigger the Civil War? Well, South Carolina declared that the fort was now under control of the Confederacy, but the U.S. troops decided not to leave, so South Carolina threatened to starve them out, block supplies so that they, were reduced to starvation and would likely leave then. But Lincoln did try to send in supplies to the troops, and so the Confederates opened fire. All right, and what advantages did both sides have? The North had more people, more industries, right? They had more factories, more money, more food, but the South had skilled fighters, they had outdoorsmen, and they had home field advantage. We'll see how this all plays out in the next 5 days of our Civil War mini unit. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your Friday. Don't forget to take that quiz, quiz number 1 from our Civil War mini unit. Please make sure you have reviewed days 1, 2, 3, 4, and obviously today, day 5, before taking that quiz. Best of luck. Thanks, everyone.